Welcome to Three Thoughts On. Today I'm very excited to have Lee Steinberg as my guest. Lee, how are you doing today?
I'm doing just great.
Thank you for making the time for me. I appreciate. I know you're a very busy man. We have a lot of interesting things that are very useful for my audience to talk about on the work that you're doing today. But before we get in there, for those people who don't know who you are, if you can give us a brief introduction about your life and how you got to the point in your journey to start doing some of this work you're doing today.
So I went to Cal Berkeley undergrad and law school, and actually I was student body president, and the governor was Ronald Reagan,
Oh, wow.
uh, who later became president. And we used to have all sorts of confrontations over the war in Vietnam, and uh, I learned everything I needed to learn about the art of negotiation and leverage from dealing with Governor Reagan. I was a dorm counselor in an undergraduate dorm working my way through law school, and they moved the freshman football team into the dorm. And in 1975, the quarterback Steve Bartkowski was the very first player picked overall in the 1975 NFL draft. And I was choosing between professions, but he asked me to represent him, and we got the largest rookie contract in NFL history. And I saw in that first experience that athletes could be role models and trigger imitative behavior. And my father had raised me with two core values. One was treasure relationships, especially family. And the second was to try to make a meaningful difference and an impact um, in the larger society and try to be someone who solved problems and relieved pain. And I saw the athletes could do that. So I asked them to retrace their roots and go back to the high school community and set up a scholarship fund or work with the church or Boys and Girls Club. At the collegiate level, set up some form of a program which bonded them with the alums. And then at the pro level, pick some cause they'd like to make an impact on and set up a charitable foundation that had the leading business figures, political figures, and community leaders on the board. So that's like Warwick Dunn, retired running back, putting the 200th single mother and her family in the first home that they'll ever own by making a down payment. It's athletes changing lives.
Well, that's what a story. What a story you have, Lee. And for a lot of people know you because of you're a legendary sports agent. You represented a number of very high profile athletes, but you also do a lot of really good work in areas that maybe are popular now, but they weren't always so popular, which is the concept of mental health and concussions and things that several well, we know it in football, but it's other sports as well, where athletes the well-being of the athlete while playing the sport, but also after retirement, um, maybe it wasn't looked at very much. And you had a part in changing that. Can you tell us a little bit more about that, please?
So I had a crisis of conscience back in the 1980s. I was representing half the starting quarterbacks in the NFL. They kept getting hit in the head, and we would go to doctors and ask, how many is too many? When should you contemplate retirement? The neurologist had no answers because the brain was the last frontier of medical research. So in 1994, I held the first player concussion safety conference, and we had players like Troy Aikman and Steve Young and Warren Moon and Drew Bledsoe come and listen to neurologists. By 2006, we kept holding the conferences, and then they had some answers that the neurologist said that three or more concussions occasions a proclivity towards Alzheimer's, premature senility, Parkinson's, chronic traumatic encephalopathy, and dementia. So I called it a ticking time bomb and an undiagnosed health epidemic. So we've continued having these conferences. This year in New Orleans, we had 2 hours of neurologists talking. We found out a couple things. First of all, for the very first time, there is the concept of neuroplasticity, which means that you can actually re-heal and rewire a concussed brain. And one process is called RTMS, which is magnets against the head, and another is neurofeedback. And both of these can re-stimulate a brain that's been concussed and avoid the inevitable spiral. So I set up a charitable foundation um, on the issue of concussion. And the goal is to bring awareness to people. And as you accurately point out, it's not just the NFL, it's college football, high school football, it's soccer with young girls heading the ball, it's hockey, it's field hockey. And so that the issues are important. So the goal is to provide money for research into more healing processes and also to help at-risk communities. So it could be inner city kids, it could be the homeless, it could be, uh, and using neurofeedback, it could be the firefighters who just went through trauma in fighting the LA fires. But the goal is to try to focus attention and to try to bring positive change.
I think that's one of the beautiful things about what you're doing is that you started it so long ago, relatively speaking, when it was something that wasn't well known by the average person, and you were doing it in the world of sports. But today we know that you can have some of these issues outside of the world of contact sports. You know, like you said, the firefighters, because they may have some trauma dealing with the hard work they do. And today, we are living in such a great time where the technology has advanced. And it must have been exciting for you to see, to go back when you started and see what was available technologically then versus what's available now, not just for the athletes, but for people like you and I who just living, regular lives.
So I went on a voyage of discovery to try and see if there were healing modalities that could stimulate long term cognitive performance, help you live longer, were anti inflammation. And so I've done a lot of sessions of hyperbaric oxygen, which can be a real healer. Something called Bimini, which takes hoses, puts them into water, oxygenates the water, and then it goes into your system. Red light, um, uh, something called Nanobi, which is cannulas. And ultimately, I'd like to take these to professional sports and collegiate sports. And if you can validate them in those communities, it raises awareness to the general population. But to do two things. One is games come down more and more if you watch the last NFL season to the fourth quarter of the last drive, or in some cases, the last play. So, is there a way to stimulate performance productivity in those critical moments to give a competitive advantage? Secondarily, when a player gets injured because of the cap system, if you're paying an offensive tackle $30 million a year, his backup by definition is someone much less talented. So when that player gets hurt, then the ability to bring him back quicker can make a major difference. Well, that same principle, being able to heal any problems we have with the joints, with the brain, is also true for the rest of us. And so, um, these there's a revolution going on in biomed where new technologies are coming on the scene every day. And as you referenced, it's an exciting time to be alive because you've got preventative solutions, first of all, and better treatments for a whole variety of maladies.
No, that is indeed the case. You and I have had a couple of conversations about about the benefits of hyperbaric oxygen therapy, and I personally have my own chamber. We talked about that, and you get into a protocol, and you can see and you can feel the benefit of that, whether it's with hyperbarics or with red light therapy or with infrared saunas or with oxygenation, or even simple things like cold plunges, which of course athletes know very well because cold plunges have been very familiar for professional athletes for so long. But now some of these things are exciting because yes, the athletes, you know, are benefiting more and more, but now some of that is becoming affordable for the average person as well, who has two jobs, right? Or, the single mom, the single dad, the people who are out there just trying to make a living. You see more and more centers opening up, offering these types of services, whether it's Upgrade Labs or, anyone else. And again, having you started so early, it must be amazing to see that this is now available beyond the world of sports.
So, for example, you mentioned infrared sauna, and their first studies are coming out showing that it has an effect on preventing cancer, and it has an effect on preventing heart attack, and that people are much healthier. And with each of the modalities that you talked about, um, uh, people are going to live to be 120, 130. It may be too late for my generation, but certainly for our children's generation, there's no logical reason that people have to leave the earth. And again, the defect of Western medicine has been that it takes already existing problems and heals them, but it doesn't do much in terms of trying to prevent them from ever happening in the first place. And all those treatments that you just mentioned um, mean that we're going to have Rafael around for a long time.
That well, I hope so. I hope so. It's interesting you mentioned that. I was having a conversation with a neurologist a few weeks back, and we were just going back and forth on some of this excitement times that the exciting times that we live in, and the role of medicine. And we were talking about if I get hit by a bus outside of the office here, the first thing I'm going to do is go to the ER and let them put me back together because trauma medicine has done a great job over the years in really helping people come out of something physical, a fall, an accident of some sort. But to your point, it doesn't really do a good job to prevent the disease. And what we're finding out today is just like you said, we have all these different modalities, we have all these different things, but really the answer is how to create a combination, if you will, a cocktail of modalities that works for you, which may be a little bit different than the one that works for me, and it's certainly different like than the one that works for a professional athlete, right? So you've had some experience with that as well.
So, one of the key features in all of this is diet. And remember that the human race was around in some form for hundreds and hundreds of thousands of years. There is anecdotal evidence that people were here a million years ago, maybe in a slightly different form. And all that time, there was no grain. It's not until 5,000 years ago that we put grain in a diet, and there was no refined sugar. So all of a sudden, Western diet has not been wonderful for health and diseases that don't exist in primitive societies that don't have refined goods and the rest of it. So diet's key. We're also understanding that sleep has a major factor. We're understanding that the gut is like a second brain. So we're sort of reimagining the way the body works and how to keep it healthy.
So have you found that we, because again, you've been carrying this flag, right? That at the beginning there was very few people like you trying to carry this flag in the world of sports, and if the athletes weren't really buying into it, you knew that the general population wasn't buying into it either. And you saw that in early in your career, like you said, is if athletes can be role models and they start trying to take better care of themselves, then maybe the population will follow, right? And we know that works to a certain extent. But it must have taken a lot of work for you to convince the professional athlete world that you were playing in. And then it's also taking some work still to this day to convince the average person that there are certain things that we can do better. There are certain things when it comes to sleep, whether it's drinking alcohol, whether it's um, the quality of our diet, like you said, refined sugars, et cetera, et cetera. How much do we eat? How much do we really need to eat? Right? Do you find that in the work that you're doing, expanding that message through your foundation and the people you deal with on a daily basis, is it getting easier or are we still uphill?
The athletes themselves are tough sells because they've been acculturated since Pop Warner and Little League to believe a set of norms that are different than what you and I believe. So, if to the average person, long term health would be the chief health concern. And if a lower priority than that would be the ability to have a professional or collegiate career. And less than that, the ability to play in a given season, and less in a given game. And the least important thing would be playing that play. The athlete turns it on its head, diametrically turns it. And so the play becomes everything. So for athletes, first of all, they're young, and so long term health is an abstraction. But then they've been in a group where everyone accepts the fact that real men play with pain. You don't want to be left out of the lineup. Long term health is way out there. And so it makes it tough because it's like denial cubed, and it makes it very, very difficult. So, uh, and, and when it came to concussion, the head of the neurology uh, out, outreach for the NFL, a man named Dr. Elliot Pellman, um, way back then, went into Sports Illustrated and called me a fearmonger for raising these concerns. So it wasn't like anybody really wants to listen. The NFL and sports are much better. They have concussion protocols. They have rules stopping blocking and tackling with the head. Uh, we now know that young people ought not to play collision sports until their brain gets developed to a certain level. There are teams in the Ivy League that played football with no hitting in training camp or during practices, but they save it for the games. There's a concussion protocol. So it's, and as I told you, there's RTMS and neurofeedback. So is it getting better? Yes. But let me show you how extensive this is. The Every time an offensive lineman hits a defensive lineman at the inception of a play, it produces a low-level subconcussive event, a little bit of change. So you could have an offensive lineman who played in high school, college, and pros have 10,000 subconcussive events, none of which have been diagnosed and none of which the athlete's aware of. He just feels stunned. So they're not even diagnosed concussions unless the player gets knocked out. So, but you have all this destruction of the brain happening, and the aggregate almost certainly does the same thing as getting knocked out 4 times does.
And it goes, that is a very interesting point, and it even gets worse than that, right? Because I remember the time where I was old enough to hear the term mild concussions, right? And now we know that there is no mild concussion. A concussion is a concussion. There is an effect. There is a vibration of the brain inside the cranium, right, that creates a potential for a problem for the individual. Whether it's one, or like you said, 10,000 subconcussion events, they are additive, right? And the way to do it is to prevent and then to take care to, like you said, uh, reap the benefits of neuroplasticity, so that if you have to play the sport and you're going to be exposed to these things, that you're actually giving your brain every opportunity to do some sort of type of healing. Want to comment on that?
So I want you to consider that the world's passion, this country is NFL football, but for the world, it's what we call soccer and they call football. The basic act of heading the ball is destructive to the brain. And so young girls with thin necks and AYSO soccer have problems with this. But you would never willingly subject your brain to, to that type of pounding, and yet it's an essential part of the game.